I recently finished texturing this laser rifle model, and some people have been asking about my process of texturing this model using Blender. Since I haven't seen many advanced tutorials on complex asset texturing like this, and most tutorials of this kind seem to be using Substance Painter, I thought I might do an exemplary breakdown of one of these materials, specifically this metal barrel, which consists of a uniform metal base, a chipped paint layer, some rust, and a warning sign, which is also part of the material. I will be talking mostly about my workflow in Blender, but I won't really go into other important things like observational skills or material abstraction, partly because I am still learning these things myself. Now, if we look at this node tree, it might seem very complex, but essentially what we're looking at is a series of node groups, each of which is either a mask or a texture representing a single component of the material. These node groups are then combined to build up the final material in a similar fashion to how you would do it in, for example, Substance Painter. On the left side you can see all the component node groups, which you can also think of as layers. This middle part are the nodes that combine these components into the final maps, and on the right we have a principled shader with the maps plugged into the respective properties. When creating a material from scratch, I usually first create all the individual components, thinking about what kinds of patterns and layers this material would consist of in the real world. In this case, I started with the underlying metal, which would have a gray base color. So the first node I added was this RGB node. Technically this node is redundant because you can specify this color later in the node tree while combining these components, but I recommend doing it this way to keep your material organized in case you need to tweak things later on. The next component is some procedural noise. I wanted this material to look rough and have bumps, as based on the concept art I was going for a less sleek and high-tech look than what you would commonly see in sci-fi laser weaponry. So if we look into the node group, you can see that I use 3 noise textures at the same scale, except I multiply the scale for the last one by 0.3. This is just a way to easily control the global scale of the noise with one value. The noise textures are all mapped using generated coordinates and a mapping node to remove the stretching on the x-axis. The noise textures have 3 different levels of resolution and detail and are mixed together for the final result. This creates a pattern with different levels of detail in the texture. The next component is a rust texture, which is an image texture from cc0textures.com. For this I couldn't use generated coordinates, as there was too much distortion, so I used UV mapping and painted out the seams. Once I mapped the texture, I duplicated the texture node and mapped it with generated coordinates, making sure the overall scale was as close to the UV map texture as possible. Then all you have to do is go into texture paint mode and paint a mask that covers the seams of the UV matte version with the second version. I finally baked this result to my main UV map in 8K resolution and did the same for the height map using the same painted mask. In this case there are still some problems like stretched areas or the fact that the rotation of the texture is wrong on one side, but this will not be noticeable in the final material. If necessary, this could be fixed by adding another seam to the UV map and painting it out in the step I described before. Next, I had to create a mask for this rust texture. In this case I actually have 2 rust masks, one primary mask and one additional mask for the edges. Here you can see what the primary mask looks like. We have some uniform grunge-like pattern, as well as some small and some large patches of chipped paint that accumulated rust. The first thing I did for this mask is paint the large patches. I created a couple of stencils in Affinity Photo from reference images I found online on pages like Pixabay, and then painted this mask manually in Blender. After that I did the same thing for these smaller spots. Then I used a grunge map to add the fine detail for the mask. I used regular UV mapping, even though it creates some seams, because they are almost completely invisible in the final material, and far less problematic than distortions caused by generated coordinates. To reduce the density of this grunge map, I simply multiplied it with a noise texture and added it to the other masks to create what will become the height map. This is almost our completed rust mask. However, I did not want the large patches of chipped paint to be completely rusted over, so I created another mask with which I erased the rust from the center and confined it to the edges of these larger areas. This is simply a black image on which I paint white, where I want to erase the mask of the large patches. Then I use a mixRGB node to subtract this map from the height map. This gives us the final rust mask. As a final touch, I wanted to add some detail to this mask in order to avoid unnatural gradients from white to black, so the rust wouldn't appear to just fall off in opacity. For this I used procedural texture warping. Basically, you can warp a texture by modifying its XYZ coordinates, which are represented as RGB colors. If you mix the coordinates with a different color, you can shift these coordinates. So all you have to do is use a mixRGB node to mix the vector with, for example, a noise texture, and use the factor as an intensity slider. I have found that the linear light blend mode usually works best. Note that the factor slider is very sensitive in this case. And that's the main rust mask. Now, it wouldn't be proper rust if we didn't add some extra to the edges. So in order to do this, we must first isolate the edges on the model. For this I use the Text Tools add-on, with which I bake out a bevel mask. I won't explain how the Text Tool add-on works, but you can find tutorials of it online. Once the bevel mask is baked, I add it to the material and warp it in the same way I did before, using noise textures. I use some noise textures to break up the uniformity of the map, and that's basically it. I later realized that there also needed to be some rust where the metal plates in the front are attached, so I painted a really simple mask for that and multiplied some noise just like before. So now that I have my metal base and the rust, I add the third major component, which is the paint layer. The paint layer is actually just a color. That's an RGB node, but for convenience sake I copy the height map from the base metal to create a height and roughness output, so I don't have to go back and reference these values from the other node group later. For the dirt, I used a musgrave texture as a base with a high detail level and the dimension set to 0, which creates a very nice and simple procedural dirt texture. I multiplied it with a noise texture to reduce the density, and that's it. The grunge map is a simple image texture I found online, and I used the same method I used for the rust texture to remove the seams. The nice thing about this method is that most of the time, once you painted the seam mask once, you can reuse it for other textures as well. The sign is probably much more complex than it has to be, because when I work I don't always have everything planned out from the beginning, but I will try to explain it as best as I can. I started out with a simple image texture that I traced from a photo and a corresponding height map, which is just a blurred alpha channel. I mapped the images using a new UV map, which I projected from the side. I also painted some screws onto the model using a basic height map, which I rendered from a screw head that I modeled in Blender. I then used the sign color and alpha textures, as well as the bolts texture, to create the base color, metalness, roughness and height maps by mixing and modifying color values. Now we only need to add the rust. For this I used the same base rust texture as before and create a simple mask by mixing together several noise textures at different scales. I used the screws alpha texture to remove the noise and add back some smaller noise to the screws area. And finally, I add the rust to the color, roughness, metalness and height maps of the sign. While this node tree is visually confusing, what it does is not very complicated, and it's likely not very optimized either, but it works. What we get in the end are the property maps for the sign, as well as an alpha mask and the bolts texture, which I made use of in the later stage. These scratches are a simple scratch map, which I mixed with a high contrast noise texture to reduce the density. Then I added the texture a second time at a larger scale and added it on top of the other scratches, because the smaller scratches need to have a reduced intensity compared to the larger ones. I mixed the smaller scratches with a gray color to reduce the contrast before adding the larger scratches. Then I invert the result to get the correct height values. I wanted to add some areas of discoloration, So I painted some dirt onto a couple of areas. This is painted on the model using a stencil from a Photoshop brush pack I found online. For the burn marks in the front, I used a front UV projection and mapped an image of a radial gradient onto the model. Because this will also add the white color to other parts of the model, I selected the faces where I didn't want the image to show up and just scaled them way down in the UV map and placed them on a black pixel. To achieve the noise pattern, I used generated coordinates to map a noise texture on the model and decreased the X scale in the mapping node so it would be a little stretched. This causes a lot of stretching on other parts of the model, but this doesn't matter because the mask will be black in these areas anyways. Then I just multiplied the noise with the gradient texture to get the final result. As a final touch, I added a text carved into the paint at the front. To create this, I scratched the words into a plastic box, took photos of it and made alpha masks in Affinity Photo. I projected the text onto the model using a new UV map, which was straightened using the UV Squares add-on. These are all the components I used to make this material. As you can see, if you know a little bit about node principles and how mapping coordinates work in Blender, you can create lots of patterns and map textures without visible seams fairly easily. In the second part, I will explain how I use these node groups to build the final material using the layer-based approach. I might continue with the other materials in future parts and demonstrate some more tips and tricks about mapping textures, creating procedural patterns, and making use of baked model information.